According to the official site, the approximate minimum requirements for Tarkov is a dual-core Intel Core 2 Dual or i3 processor at 2.4 GHz, 8 GB of RAM, and a DX11 compatible graphics card with 1 GB of memory. These requirements are laughable, and here's why. I tossed up a system with a Haswell Pentium Anniversary Edition unlocked, which is faster than any 2-core i3 or Core 2 Dual on the market, especially since I have it delidded and overclocked to 4.6 GHz. For RAM, I have 12 gigs of DDR3 1333 CL9. DDR3 can go higher, but unfortunately this motherboard can't keep memory stable very well. And for graphics card, I have one of the faster 1GB DX11 cards on the market, the 5850. I know there are faster cards like the 7870 on a newer GCN1 architecture, but I couldn't get my hands on it. For settings, we're going for the absolute lowest settings, running the lowest possible resolution, which is 1 below 720p. Obviously binaural audio is off, and let's see how Tarkov runs. We load into an online PMC raid on the easiest to run map, Factory. If you look at the ping counter, you'll notice these spikes that go past 200 ms, meaning I'll eventually disconnect for high ping. Except my ping to the server is fine. The issue is my CPU can't keep up with the synchronization to server and other players, causing a really long round trip time. And this is besides the fact that I couldn't even have one gunfight without crashing. I've seen several users and people over the years claiming the system requirements section has misled them, and they bought the game thinking they could run it. Now they're SOL because BSG's customer service is abysmal and their stance on refunds can only be considered archaic. Of course I live life following the saying, never ascribe to malice that is which adequately explained by incompetence. Which is why I'm here today, because when it comes to hardware, me and a couple of guys in the tech help channel in my Discord is way more competent than BSG, so do swing by if you need help. You can say these old requirements were from when the beta first came out, but I doubt these parts could run Tarkov online and on a server back then. Offline raids, sure, but online is way more demanding and there's no way I can go back in time to test this. However, what I can do is help BSG update the requirements by testing the most demanding part of the current game, daytime streets. According to this poll in the comments underneath, many of you cannot run streets well, if at all. You can use this video as an outline for what to upgrade if you do plan on upgrading or buying a whole new PC altogether. I'll have Amazon links down below. Moving on, I built another PC, Ryzen this time, to demonstrate the true minimum requirements for Tarkov, using online daytime streets as a baseline. The PC contains a Ryzen 3100 at 4.2 GHz, 16 gigs of 3200 CL16 DDR4, and 12 gigs of page file on my SSD. A 1660 Ti for a graphics card, which is a little overloaded for bare minimum requirements, but I bought it because genius old me thought the optical zoom FPS drop was based on GPU power, but boy was I wrong, it's mostly CPU dependent. For storage we have a dirt cheap NVMe, and for motherboard we have another overloaded B550, but any half decent MOBO with memory tweaking options is fine because Tarkov needs XMP. If you're wondering where I'm getting these parts, they're from Facebook Market and my credit card. I have nobody sponsoring these videos, and the last time I made a hardware video it was a massive time investment with little to no returns. But I feel like my last video helped a lot of you out there, and there are new questions every day in the tech help channel of my Discord. So if you want to support my poor choices, I've made a Patreon and I'll be re-uploading videos without ads, link in the description and comments. For testing methodology, we'll test with 16 gigs of RAM XMP off, then 16 gigs XMP on, and finally upgrading to 32 gigs XMP on. XMP settings are 3200 MHz CL16 with the uClock ratios 1:1. For settings, everything lowest at 1080p, PostFX off, binaural audio off. MIP streaming also off. I ran a lot of both SCAV and PMC raids daytime only. However, on my SCAV I only benchmarked raids that started around the 45-minute mark. This is because as the raid goes on, there are less and less players to synchronize with. So CPU usage goes way down and you'll get a lot more performance. We don't want these high FPS results because the first 10 minutes of streets lags the most, but at the same time contains the most deciding factors to how the rest of your raid plays out. For optics, I ran 1x or irons to keep our FPS consistent as zoom optics drops FPS, and I made sure to restart my game after every single raid to eliminate as much memory leak issues as possible. Our benchmark route consists of running down the road and hitting up scav bodies, and loosely looting these buildings as that's where most players loot. If we survive all of this, then we might swing by the 2 bodies by the Lexus building, as the Lexus area is where we'll encounter the most FPS drops. This route has way too many variables to be scientific, so instead of being 100% consistent on every single run, I ran 30 or more raids per individual RAM setup to have enough data points for an approximate average. Doing it this way is the best way to get an example of what to expect in a real world scenario. This is the biggest reason why I haven't been streaming. I've been benching these super boring raids with volume off and watching Netflix on the side. And while I was working on this video, BSG dropped a patch that bumped performance on streets by a tiny bit. And when I mean a tiny bit, I mean around 10%. So I had to re-bench all over again from the beginning. Once this video drops, I'll be streaming more at twitch.tv/tayoff, link down below. On to results. With my CPU at 4.2 GHz and XMP off, I'm averaging around 42.6 FPS with 1% lows at 20.9. And with that, we accurately hit the acceptable cinematic 30 FPS minimum requirements on the dot. But that's not enough. Tarkov performance is heavily dependent on memory speed. So let's turn on XMP and see what happens. With XMP on, we average a nice 52.1 FPS with 1% lows at 25. We're nearing the 60 FPS mark here, and I would consider this perfectly playable if you have a monitor that supports FreeSync or G-Sync. But our dips are still very low. So how can we fix these dips? If you paid attention to the top left corner of the video, you'll notice that Tarkov is constantly eating more than 16 gigs of RAM. If you only have 16 gigs, then your FPS will drop whenever your game wants to swap files with your page file, which is on a much slower form of memory, your SSD. Tossing in another 16 gigs of RAM into the RAID, giving us a total of 32 gigs at 3200 MHz, gives us an average of 56.4 FPS, which is slightly better than our 16 gigs. However, our 1% lows are still pretty bad at 34.6 FPS, which doesn't seem like much of an increase, but this 10 FPS is a massive difference. Why? Because your average minimum FreeSync and G-Sync range on budget monitors is around 30 to 40 Hz, meaning if our game is dipping below 30 FPS, then we'll lose our variable refresh rate smoothness when it drops. But because our 1% lows are at 35 FPS, we're within the variable refresh rate range. So what are these results for? What is the conclusion and what's the point of this video? Testing this PC has given us enough data for the approximate minimum requirements for patch 0.13. From these parts, we can extrapolate the requirements by comparing relative performance to other PC parts. So here are the bare minimum requirements for near 60 Hz gameplay at 1080p in Tarkov. For CPU, we have the AMD Ryzen 3100 or higher, with Precision Boost Overdrive on, so boosting over 4.2 GHz. Or a 4-core Intel CPU, 6th generation or higher at 4.4 GHz. So a 6600K overclocked to 4.4 GHz. Weaker non-overclockable i5s like the 6500 or 7400 do not boost high enough to reach 60 FPS for Tarkov. For memory, we need a minimum of 16 GB of 3200 MHz DDR4, with page filing on an SSD. For graphics card, we need 6 to 8 GB of VRAM. For AMD, you'll need an R9 390 8GB or an RX 480/580 8GB or better. For Nvidia, your minimum can be a 1060 or a 1660 6GB or better. How did I come up with this? If you look at the performance overlay again, Tarkov absolutely guzzles VRAM, constantly eating over 4GB at 1080p. However, MIP streaming mitigates some of this VRAM usage, so with MIP streaming on, we can use cards that are 4GB. For AMD, we have the R9 290, RX 470/570, and the 6500 XT or better. For Nvidia, we have the GTX 970 and the GTX 1650. You might be able to get away with a 1063GB, but I can't test this unless one of you wants to ship me one. And for MIP streaming to work well, you'll need an SSD. On to requirements for around 75 Hz refresh rate at 1080p, around medium to high settings. And I came up with these results by browsing the comment section of the poll. And it gave me a good idea of what recommended should be, especially when I myself have a similar mid-range PC. For CPU, you'll need an AMD 6-core Ryzen, at least 3600 or 5500 and higher. On Intel 14nm chips, you'll need at least 6 cores, boosting to 4.4 GHz or higher. Again, any non-K series that don't all-core boost to around 4.4 GHz is not good enough. For memory, you'll need 32 gigs of 3200 MHz DDR4. The same amount of page files before is fine, but it's not mandatory. For graphics card, we have 6 to 8GB VRAM cards that are one step faster than our previous selection. On AMD's side, there's the RX 5600 XT and RX 6600 or higher. And for Nvidia, you have the 1070, 1660 Ti, and 3050. For storage, same as before, any kind of SSD is fine. Now recommended requirements for a consistent 100Hz or higher refresh rate. For CPU, we have the Ryzen 5800X3D and any CPU in the Ryzen 7000 lineup. And for Intel, we have the 12th or 13th gen with at least 6 P cores, boosting to around 4.4 GHz. So you don't really need a K series. As long as the P cores all core boost to around 4.4 GHz, you'll reach that 100 FPS, 100 Hz mark. For memory, we'll need at least 32 gigs of 3600 DDR4 with decent timings, or 6000 MHz DDR5. And for graphics card, if you're on 1080p, then you can make do with the same thing as before. But assuming you'll be running a higher resolution monitor, then you'll need something with more than 8 gigs of VRAM. I had 3 friends that ran 1440p. 2 of them had cards with 8 gigs of VRAM, and 1 of them had a 3090. Guess who stutters sometimes, and guess who didn't stutter at all? So to be safe, we'll be aiming for cards with a fat stack of VRAM. On AMD's side, we have the Radeon 7, which you probably don't have and can't acquire. So go for the RX 6700 XT or higher instead. For Nvidia's side, we have the 2080 Ti and the 3080. However, I think you can make do with a 1080 Ti or a 3060 because they both have enough VRAM. You might be able to do 1440p due to their massive VRAM buffers, but you won't be able to crank other settings up, as we're nearing the limitations on GPU, not VRAM in these 2 cases. Okay, now seeing these requirements, you'll have a rough idea on what to upgrade. If you need help, swing by the Discord of course, but let's go back to our build and see what the most reasonable upgrade path is. We currently have a Ryzen 3100 with PBO boosting to around 4.2 GHz, 32 gigs of 3200 MHz DDR4, and a 1660 Ti. Out of these 3 parts, only one belongs in the minimum requirements. So let's drop in a Ryzen 5500 to reach the recommended requirements for every spec. With the new CPU, we average a solid 71.2 FPS with a 1% low of 44.1, which is perfectly acceptable. Unfortunately, if you're on a laptop and your CPU cannot boost to the frequencies I mentioned earlier, you're out of luck. I always feel bad when someone comes into the tech help channel asking for tuning advice and they own a lappy-toppy, because laptops are thermally limited, so the manufacturer will lock down settings to preserve hardware life, so there's nothing I can do for them. If you're planning on building a new PC, the rest of the video is going to be example builds. There will be links in the description for each part. As always, I hope this helped. Like the video, sub with Bell, Patreon, Twitch in the description and comments. Thanks for watching and see you guys in a couple of days.
Ну что, неплохой день, господа.